this conference together. And I would also like to acknowledge some of the other sponsors, such as Friends of the Earth Melbourne, the Kurdish Democratic Association Victoria, Aid Watch, and yeah, there's a whole host of a range of sponsors who have helped put this conference together. And yeah, I'd like to all thank them for all their support. And at the end, Green Left is the host of this conference, and we're proud to host Ecosocialism 2023 and provide a platform for the voices of peace, justice and ecological sustainability that the corporate media consistently ignores. Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Jacob. So for our first session is Fight Climate Change, Not War. And the session will, starting a little bit late, but we're still trying to finish at 11:20, just so you've got a bit of a time frame. This session counterposes two critical matters, the climate crisis and the warmongering that the Australian government is party to. The Albanese government is purchasing 8 nuclear-powered submarines under the aggressive AUKUS military pact at a cost of at least $368 billion. This is the single biggest expenditure on Australian military capacity since colonisation. It is also taking the world closer to nuclear war and environmental disaster. At the same time, this government is ignoring the urgency of the climate crisis and the need to take earnest climate action. So the challenge for us today is to build a powerful international movement that can force the fossil fuel industries, the war industries, and our governments to stop this jingoism and to address the threat of climate apocalypse. Our speakers will examine this in detail. You'll be addressed by 4 speakers. After the 4 speakers have spoken, I will take a list of those here who would like to contribute, so please indicate to me by raising your hand, and for anybody online, I'll be referring to Kamala and Alex. I may not know your name, but I will try to keep track. This session will be live streamed, so please be aware that if you're asking a question or making a point for discussion, that it will be filmed and eventually go on YouTube. Each contribution should be no longer than 3 minutes, and I will inform you when you've got 30 seconds left, and I'll give you a bit of a tab to wind up. These procedures just will facilitate a fair and inclusive discussion. The speakers will speak for 15 minutes each, and I'll give you a 5-minute notice and then a wrap-up notice. Our 4 speakers are, first up, it's Pip Hinman here on my left. Pip is the co-editor of Green Left and a member of the Socialist Alliance National Executive. She's a long-term Sydney Stop the War Coalition activist who helped organise mass campaigns against the US-led wars on Afghanistan and Iraq. She's now active in Sydney Anti-AUKUS Coalition. Second speaker is online, Senator Jordon Steele-John. Senator Steele-John is an Australian Greens senator for WA and holds the portfolios of Foreign Affairs, Peace and Nuclear Disarmament, Health, Disability Rights and Services. He has been outspoken against the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal in Parliament. Our third speaker, again here in person, Clifton D'Rozario. Clifton is an elected leader of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist Liberation. He is involved in the campaign to unionise and fight for the conditions of Dalit sanitation workers in Karnataka state. And our fourth speaker is online as well, Reihana Mohideen. Reihana is National Council member of the Party of the Labouring Masses of the Philippines and the head of the party's international work. So I'll hand over to Pip.
Well, thank you, Sibylla, and to my fellow panellists. It is exciting to be here at Ecosocialism 2023. I want to also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Well, Australia has only just removed itself from its longest ever war, helping devastate Afghanistan and reinstalling tyrants. And already sections of the ruling class are preparing us for another one, this time against China. But the Vietnam syndrome lives on. We didn't stop the coalition of the willing from invading Iraq, privatising its assets and installing puppets and then denying many Iraqi refugees a home here. But the working class here, like counterparts around the world, will resist a new war unless absolutely necessary. The recent Defence Strategic Review confirms it's all about helping the United States project its military power into Asia at any cost. Australia argues it needs a forward defence policy, and that is the justification for allocating enormous sums to military expenditure over the next 3 decades, which actually has nothing to do with defence. Even defence, the Department of Defence concedes there is no real serious threat of invasion. Still, we're being told that deterrence must guide defence policy, even nuclear deterrence. At the same time, we're being promised by Labor we're being promised by Labor that it doesn't support nuclear proliferation. It's looking very closely at signing the new nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty, and blah, blah, blah. However, it is carrying out the AUKUS deal, which in its first phase was signed by the coalition with Labor support and is dutifully behaving like the US's deputy sheriff in the Asia-Pacific. Marching lockstep with the biggest imperialist and military power in the world, the United States, our supposedly left-wing Prime Minister has signed up for greater militarism even than his predecessors. AUKUS and the new Strategic Defence Review have set the country on a pathway to a new war. Labor's Foreign Affairs Minister, Penny Wong, is dutifully doing the rounds of the Asia-Pacific, building up support for this. PNG seems to be the latest country to sign up, offering the US full access to its defence facilities. But Japan, Fiji and the Philippines are partners as well. Defence Minister Richard Marles is keen to bring Japan in, so we could have a JAUKUS. And now Canada and New Zealand have indicated interest in AUKUS Pillar Number 2. Well, the Russian war in Ukraine is the backdrop to them ramping up fear about security and defence in this part of the world, even though the US began its pivot to Asia under Barack Obama. The whole idea of trying to contain China began under Obama, when the US Democrats decided China was just growing too fast and had to be challenged. The idea that military containment could stop China's economic growth and influence is absolutely ridiculous. China is a country of 1.45 billion people. Its huge growth has been largely domestically focused, even while it is trying to build up soft power among the global south and in the Pacific. It's got 4 military bases. Compare that to, I think the US is about 900 bases in about 70 countries. China is in a territorial dispute with the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia and Taiwan over the Spratly Islands. And internally we know it is carrying out oppression against national minorities such as the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. It's severely increased its repression against the democracy movement in Hong Kong. But none of this justifies going to war against China. The US, of course, as we know, is pushing to make Taiwan the centre of this new war on China, and others may say more about that. But the idea of going to war with China on any grounds is completely mad. It would not be a conventional war, as China and the US have nuclear weapons and neither have promised not to use them. Well, according to China Briefing, as of last year, China is Australia's biggest bilateral trading partner in products and services. Australia is China's 5th biggest source of imports and its 10th largest export market for coal, gas, iron ore and other minerals. Then wine and gold follows that. And during the last 26 years, exports from Australia to China have increased at an annual rate of around 17%. this represents something significant, and the repercussions of a war, of course, would be huge in terms of impact on Australia. We can say more about the racial element as well. The giant arms manufacturing corporations are also using the war drive on China to increase weapons production to justify allocating upwards of $368 billion over 30 years on nuclear-powered submarines, and to help the US shipbuilding industry. They also want to update and expand Australia's long-range missiles, enlarge several military bases to fit the US war machines. So along with the proposal to extend NATO into the Asia-Pacific, AUKUS is essentially turning this country into a US garrison. Well, stopping a new war before it starts is not an easy task. We know that from when John Howard was prepared to lie to get us into the coalition of the willing. Back then, Labor in opposition was against the invasion, and so building the movement at the time was made slightly easier. Today, we are essentially up against a coalition Labor pro-war alliance. But some divisions have begun to open up in the Australian ruling class, some sections of which are still making billions of dollars from trade with China. And because of these divisions among Australia's ruling elites, including inside Labor, our job is to find allies to help amplify the main messages, this has been made slightly easier, although it's not without its difficulties. And the difficulties arise from a range of class perspectives. So the left has to patiently explain its views about peace and security without sowing illusions that the elites will save us. While Paul Keating, a former Labor Prime Minister, and Bob Carr, a former Labor Defence Minister, both been very outspoken against the AUKUS submarine deal, they also support upgrading the military, and they wouldn't say no to a bipartisan plan for Australia to become one of Australia's top 10 weapons manufacturers. So differences over the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal are playing out in Labor's base, with several progressive unions, including the Maritime Workers Union, the Electrical Trades Union and others, and Labor Council secretaries actively campaigning against AUKUS, and the estimate of 20,000 or so jobs. But we know that more jobs can be created in addressing social and ecological need. For instance, Beyond Zero Emissions has calculated 1.8 million jobs could be created over a 5-year plan to reboot Australia as a low-carbon economy. These jobs could be created in investment in renewable energy, making homes and other buildings energy efficient, better mass transit and cycling lanes, green manufacturing, land use and regeneration, recycling, education, training and research. All the jobs and estimates have been made. So building a movement to stop the drive to war and force governments to spend on social and ecological need now is at the centre of Socialist Alliance's work today, and it's what we try and amplify in Green Left. Well, the division in the Labor Party showed up recently at its Brisbane Labor conference, where a pro-AUKUS motion from the Australian Workers Union failed, much to their surprise, and an anti-AUKUS motion moved by the ETU, the Electrical Trades Union, was passed. This debate will come up again at the Federal Conference in Brisbane, where an anti-AUKUS protest is being organised on August 18. Now, a debate has also opened up among some defence analysts and strategic studies people at universities over whether China is, in fact, threatening our strategic space. If the US is becoming a less reliable ally, they argue, Australia needs to become more self-reliant. But, of course, self-reliance for a section of the ruling class really means deterrence, and all that associated with different weapons build-ups, including nuclear-powered submarines. Self-reliance for progressives and leftists is an entirely different thing. It involves developing an independent, peaceful foreign policy, in particular eradicating the whole threat of nuclear weapons in conjunction with our Asia-Pacific neighbours. But even at this early stage, there are signs of progress. Not everyone is convinced about government hype on militarism and war. And after this, in Australia anyway, a groundswell of against the Cold War militarist push, there's an older generation in Australia of anti-nuclear activists working with a younger generation now to rebuild the next phase of the anti-war movement. The 2020, a recent poll from the Lowy Institute, a conservative think tank in Australia, had its interesting layout of Australian attitudes to the world, and it's got some interesting data in it. A poll was being done just as the AUKUS deal was being formally signed in San Diego, when the polarisation actually had yet to begin. But even so, less people were prepared to say AUKUS would make Australia and the region a safer place. And there was a corresponding rise in those saying AUKUS will make Australia and the region less safe. So these changes, while they're small and early, are still important to clock. They do signal disquiet at Anthony Albanese's Labor's all the way with the USA approach. So climate change is the real threat, and the Asia-Pacific region which is overwhelmingly part of the global south, is facing its very threat to survive. Island nations in the Pacific have been asking for Australia's help against rising sea levels for decades. The former coalition government just laughed, and the current government is just talking out of both sides of its mouth. Labor says climate change is real and then adopts the miserably low carbon emission target. Conveniently for Australia, exports of coal and gas are not counted in the IPCC targets because those sorts of emissions, called Scope 3 emissions, are not included. Only a much stronger climate movement is going to be able to force the ruling elites to take climate change seriously. And this new phase of the anti-war movement has to work out how to link up with the environmental activists, particularly the School Strike for Climate activists, whose knowledge of the climate risks are very, very real and great. They know it. War, of course, is the ultimate climate destroyer. The climate war is the war we need to fight. Far from it being over, it continues under a ruling party which is under big challenge now in Parliament from the Greens. We know that's not enough, which is why Socialist Alliance is committed to helping build the extra parliamentary movements together with First Nations activists, for whom the race to a new war is layered over the top of the wars they fight every day for survival. Thank you.
Thank you, Pip, for that very instructive outline. Our next speaker is online, Senator Jordon Steele-John.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the Ecosocialism conference. Oh, I'm just checking, is my audio coming through okay? Oh, I see somebody cringing a bit like it might not be. I can't hear any responses from the room, so if somebody could just give me a thumbs up if it's okay. You're muted, but somebody's just said go ahead. Go ahead.
It's just a little bit loud at our end. We're just trying to sort that out.
Okay. Do you want me to pause until that's resolved? I don't want to hurt people's ears.
Okay, I think we've just worked it out.
Awesome. All right.
Go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So as I was saying, thank you so much to Ecosocialism and the organisers for inviting me to be part of this conversation this morning. It is such an important discourse to be engaged in. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered together today on unceded First Nations land. I'm talking to you from Noongar Budja here in the South Metropolitan region of Western Australia, and I want to pay respects to elders past and present and fundamentally acknowledge that sovereignty over First Nations land has never been ceded. Now, this is a critical thing to do whenever we gather together. It is particularly vital to do when we gather together to discuss matters of war and peace, of violence and of colonial and imperial conquest. And I think it's important to ground those conversations in an acknowledgement that the most impactful, the most serious, and the conflict with the most ongoing impact which the colonial state of Australia has ever engaged in is in fact the war of invasion and conquest that was begun against First Nations people upon settler arrival, and in many ways continues to this day. I think it is a really excellent thing to see so many people come together from across the country to talk about AUKUS and to organise to push back against AUKUS in the context of the vital work of creating a world post-capitalism, creating a world beyond the vulturistic political dynamic with which Australian politics has become so enamoured through the last couple of decades. I want to make a few key points about AUKUS from my perspective, speaking in my capacity as the Australian Greens spokesperson for peace, nuclear disarmament and foreign affairs. Firstly, I think it is really vital that we as a broad anti-war movement frame AUKUS and engage with the propositions of AUKUS with a clear understanding of what precisely it is. And I think from my perspective, it is a political pact between nations engaged in and masterminded because of domestic political reasons. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of discourse around AUKUS in the mainstream media, which would seek to persuade the community that AUKUS is a defence pact. AUKUS is a response to changing strategic global power dynamics, or however many buzzwords you want to add into that various kind of jingoistic soup that often comes out of the media when they attempt defense analysis or foreign policy analysis. The reality is AUKUS has its origin in the domestic political needs of three politicians: Joe Biden, Scott Morrison, and who was the Boris Johnson. How could I forget that man's name? That absolute joke of a human being. So those three men at a particular point in time, for domestic political reasons, needed a distraction. They needed something to reset the domestic conversation in relation to their political tenures. Morrison needed something to wedge the ALP in order to create a point of difference on national security, because he and his administration believed that was the only way that they would win the election. And they believed that AUKUS was so outrageous, so ridiculous, proposing as it does to expend at least $370 billion on the creation of nuclear-powered submarines that will not be delivered for another 30 years, that will sign us up to being a large-scale, long-term nuclear waste dump, and will bind us to an ally with a demonstrated history of terrible judgments when it comes to foreign policy. They believe that all of those factors together, let alone the tension that it would create in our region, would drive the ALP to oppose it, therefore creating a clear point of political difference at the election. Boris Johnson needed it because his domestic political context was so severe, was so terminal at that point, that he would have rather been in the streets of Kyiv than in Westminster, where daily the corruption and ineptitude of his administration was being revealed and centered even in the tabloid-dominated press. And Joe Biden and the Americans more broadly were reeling in the aftershock of the worst military disaster they have experienced since the fall of Saigon. Internationally, America's reputation on the global stage was in tatters. Everyone could see that their 20 years of military adventurism in Afghanistan had failed completely. They had, in fact, spent trillions of dollars, given how many lives and created the terror and mutilation of so many Afghan people, and done all of this simply to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, and everybody could see it. So those three men needed AUKUS for a domestic political reason, and presented it to the world as a well thought through defense strategic alliance in response to global geopolitical factors, when it was in fact something that was given light for those domestic reasons. Now, why is that important to make that distinction? I believe it is important because when we frame AUKUS as it is, in my view, in that reality, then we make it easier to critique. We make it easier to explain to the community the risks of this political deal and why it should be so opposed by the community. It makes it okay, if you like, to criticize it, because it is the comfortable role of Australian community to critique dodgy political deals. Whereas there has been so much effort made by people in positions of power to basically push the public away from decisions around defence and foreign policy and frame them as things that you should leave to the smart people in the various departments or in senior levels of government. Now, once we've opened the door to those to that conversation with the community more broadly, I have three areas where I believe there should be as much focus as possible on the risks of AUKUS, the impact that it will have both on the Australian community and our region. And I just want to quickly take you through each of them in turn. First of all, there is the binding of Australia to the United States. And I think in the aftermath of the war in Afghanistan, having just passed the point of ending that war 20 years on and seeing the horrific impact that that has had on the people of Afghanistan, the horrific impact that it continues to have on the people of Afghanistan, as well as the incredible impact that it has had on so many that were either forced to fight in the war, ended up fighting in the war, or the families that supported them while that was going on, as well as the horrendous war crimes committed by Australian forces in Afghanistan. All of those give us a contemporary example of why it is so risky for us to be so deeply bound up with the United States of America. And of course, I would imagine that everybody in the room innately understands that risk, and like me, would also cite the Iraq War, would also cite the Vietnam War, would also cite the involvement of America in coups against democratically elected governments, whether they be Salvador Allende in Chile, whether they be Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, whether they be the countless other numbers of regimes elected by democratic masses that have been knocked over, undermined, and ousted by American intelligence services and the military complex in the United States. All of these things add up to the picture of an ally that is dangerous, and an ally that does not have good judgment, an ally that in the post-war period has demonstrated again and again that it enters military conflicts for its own domestic political purposes. It continues with them as long as those conflicts are in its domestic political and also economic interests, and it exits them for its own domestic and economic interests. During those conflicts, it is a horrendous house guest. It scars the countries that it occupies and leaves them in shambles when it exits. That is the history of the United States impact in the world post the Second World War. And we need to, as a movement, really validate, I think, the suspicion that already exists within the Australian community in relation to the US as a partner, because I think people understand actually that there are a lot of risks in that relationship, and that AUKUS actually fundamentally binds us together with the United States in a way that will make it almost impossible to extract ourselves in the future. The second concern that I think is really front of my mind is the environmental impact of AUKUS, either in terms of the way in which it will require Australian communities to host nuclear waste dumps, or to subject themselves to close proximity to nuclear reactors within these machines directly off our shores, and also the environmental impact that will come in the opportunity cost. Because of the way in which the acceleration of military tension in our region will undermine global efforts to build consensus around actual urgent climate action. We cannot expect to be able to sit around an international table and negotiate the kind of global coordinated human action that is needed to resolve the climate crisis while simultaneously aiming a nuclear-powered pistol at the heads of half of the people at the table. That's just not on. And finally, I would say, because I know I'm coming close to time, that the third element that really gives me concern here is with AUKUS specifically, is the way in which it solidifies and supercharges the military-industrial complex here in Australia. What this diversion of public funds effectively does is create within our country, or enlarge within the country because it already exists, a huge presence of the defence industry within our manufacturing and education sectors specifically. And we've already seen it. The South Australian Premier, for instance, has proudly said that he hopes that schools and universities take up the opportunities of AUKUS by training kids in the STEM and other research backgrounds that will enable them to take advantage of AUKUS. So many research grants and scientific fields of study are now reorienting around defence industry needs in preparation for AUKUS. And we know that this creates an industrial and research dynamic in which both of those entities of our community are dependent upon the military industry, which is therefore in turn dependent upon a military conflict to self-sustain. The very last thing that I will say is that I think as a movement we need to stay clear that while war with China or any other nation would be catastrophic and must be resisted, preventing war, I believe, should not be our only metric of success. I think our metric of success should be preventing the escalation of tension with our neighbors and with China, particularly in the region, because even if we don't get to that point of open conflict, we know from history, from the Cold War particularly, that there is still a massive human cost, let alone an economic cost, to an undeclared war of escalation and an attempt to economically and militarily encircle a nation, which harms nations like Australia and will ultimately end up harming nations like China and others as well. So the Greens are committed to continuing to work with the broader anti-war movement to oppose AUKUS at every single legislative step, and to use our capacity to work with Green Left and Socialist Alliance to organise those extra parliamentary tactics and movements that are needed to be able to push back against AUKUS, and to ultimately scrap it and to build an independent and peace-based foreign policy and defence policy for Australia. And I really look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Jordon. That was a great outline of the motivations and risks. And now we're moving to Clifton.
Hi, good morning. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me here. I'm also going to try and remember to speak a little slowly. I just tend to have a tendency to just race through this. My brief basically is to try and look at this particular juncture we are at in geopolitics from an Indian Communist Party's point of view. I'm from the CPML Liberation in India. So I just thought maybe I'd start with a kind of a broad overview of where India's foreign policy stands today. So India's Can I go ahead? Is it okay now? Damn. So India's foreign policy, I mean, if one were to look at it, it's one that is driven by the belief in its global power status, primarily on account of its market, economic and military strength, geostrategic location, and an ancient civilizational status. And like any other foreign policy, it is largely an extension of its domestic policy. In the period immediately after independence, the core of India's foreign policy was its desire for decision-making autonomy, emerging as it was from the status of a disempowered colony under the British. And it gained a certain global stature, almost like a moral global leader, championing causes of anti-colonialism and taking up the interests of previously colonized poorest countries by helping create institutions such as the non-aligned movement. This continued until the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is the time when India started building closer ties with the Western powers, especially the United States. And this has only been strengthened as the domestic situation in India veers towards fascism. In India today, the twin trajectories of neoliberal economic policies and aggressive Hindu supremacist, which defines Indian nationalism today, has converged to bring Narendra Modi to the power in 2014, and the government has systematically used its state power to advance this two-pronged agenda. This Indian fascism is trying to secure domestic support and global approval by combining its Hindu supremacist hypernationalism with its pro-US foreign policy that leverages the global attraction for the Indian market, corporate India's growing integration with global capital, and India's strategic role as a close ally of the US and Israel. Also leveraged, as in Australia, is the vast Hindu diaspora across the world that Modi considers the purveyors of its interests in other countries. Of course, India is also a part of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where it shares a platform with Russia and China to maintain a sense of autonomy and distance from the US-led West. But it's Modi's personal autonomy with leaders like Biden, previously Trump, Rishi Sunak, previously Boris Johnson, and Netanyahu, which expresses the sheer direction and thrust of Modi government's foreign policy. The growing identification of India's foreign policy with the strategic priorities of the United States is accompanied by India's worsening relations and growing isolation with almost all its neighbors, resulting in a major setback to the prospects of regional cooperation and friendly ties with the neighbors. For a long time after 2002, the 2002 Gujarat genocide, Modi, as the Gujarat chief minister, was denied a visa by several countries in the Western world, including the US and UK. But with the growing ascendance of right-wing authoritarianism in global politics, Modi as a prime minister has received strong support from the US-led Western world. Most recently, in May 2023, the cheering diaspora fans in Sydney's Quadras Arena, I think, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese proclaimed Narendra Modi to the world as the boss, followed by Biden's red carpet treatment to Modi in June 2023. Again, another endorsement, a significant endorsement of Modi. As my friend just previously said, more often than not, this is in support of the domestic political kind of purpose that Modi has at this point. So India's External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, in a recent book of his, he comments on this endorsement as follows. Going up in the global power hierarchy, whether in terms of capability or influence, is only one element of India's rise. Our nation has other journeys to make in parallel. In the last few decades, we have heard more authentic voices, authentic quote unquote, please, voices as democratization, quote unquote, takes deeper roots. These changes in our nationalist culture have been affirmed, among others, through political and electoral outcomes. So quite apart from its growing prominence, the world is today required to come to terms with this changing India. In effect, what Mr. Jaishankar is saying is that the growing redefinition of what democracy is in India and the kind of electoral success that the BJP enjoys today means it's a changed India. And as opposed to India coming to terms with the global world, it's the world that has to come to terms with this changing India. And that as in almost a complete, a total acceptance of things as it were. There's much, these significant endorsements of the Modi regime comes at a time when China has emerged as a major economic powerhouse and the US-led imperialistic bloc is searching for new avenues to counter China in an attempt to maintain and strengthen a unipolar world order. Now turning to China, and this I think is essential for us to say, what we see is that the CPC's record of socialist modernization has turned the country into the second most powerful economy in the world, marked by maladies like aggravated social, regional and gender disparities, growing cronyism and corruption, ideological cultural degeneration, and the brutal suppression of dissent, nationality movements in Tibet and Xinjiang regions, the autonomy movements in Hong Kong and Macau, and the continued oppression of the Uyghur Muslim minority population. With socialism being defined primarily in terms of the Communist Party leadership of the state, which in turn is reduced increasingly to the centrality of the core leader, and capitalism predominating over aspects of socialism in the country, what has emerged in China today is a capitalism with Chinese characteristics. What ahead? Globally, right-wing regimes are on the rise, and aiding this rise is this current phase of prolonged and deep economic decline of global capitalism, compounded by a massive disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, there's a shift towards a relatively multipolar world with a crisis within the US and its allies facing an aggressively expansionist Russia and an economically powerful China. Even as Yemen and Palestine continue to be ravaged by Saudi Arabia and Israel respectively, a major war is being fought in Europe with a fascistic Putin regime in Russia invading Ukraine. Our party has categorically condemned Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, insisting on cessation of war and restoration of peace guaranteeing the sovereignty of Ukraine. We do not accept the Russian narrative that invokes NATO's eastward expansion as a justification for the ongoing war. However, there can be no mistaking the fact that while both Ukraine and Russia bleed in the war, and much of the world has a price to pay, the US benefits the most without any direct involvement in the war. Historically, the US has used NATO to sustain its geopolitical and military domination throughout the Cold War and post-Soviet periods, and has gone on expanding NATO. This expansion is not just to contain Russia and its growing cooperation with China. It is also to retard the rise of Europe as a parallel power. After the Islamophobic so-called global war on terror, the US is now trying to recreate the Cold War environment, and several sections of the pro-US ideologues and propagandists portray the Russia-China partnership as the new danger to the world. The internal character of these competing global powers are, of course, a great concern to all of us. Yet, a multipolar world is certainly more advantageous to progressive forces and movements worldwide in the quest for reversal of neoliberal policies, social transformation, and political advance. We must recognize that the US strategy of containment of Russia and China is solely aimed at global hegemony of US imperialism and stopping the world from becoming multipolar. As revolutionary communists, we struggle for shared global peace and planetary survival. To this end, we shall continue to fight for reversal of policies of neocolonial domination, imperialist intervention, military aggression, and environmental destruction and climate crisis, while insisting on a reorientation of our country's foreign policy and its global position towards these goals. In specific, if one were to look at India's relationship with China, it's one that is quite troubled. We've had a war with China, and there have been several instances of skirmishes over the past few years. This is in regard to a border dispute. The Modi government has refused to come clear with the actual state of affairs, stepping up anti-China rhetoric for domestic political calculations, even as India's imports from China reached a record high in 2022, and trade deficit surged beyond $100 billion. In India's own interest, this needs peaceful resolution of disputes and consistent diplomatic engagement to the end. The other plane is China, of course, is an emerging big power. The US wants to cultivate India as an ally in a strategy of containing and encircling China. India need not have any exaggerated threat perception from China. On the contrary, there's considerable ground for cooperation in the region, in the regional and global context. India is a constituent of BRICS and SCO and needs to explore these platforms seriously instead of being drawn by the US into Quad and related strategic exercises and initiatives, which only result in India getting more isolated from all neighbors and increasingly also from the Gulf. We want Ukraine to successfully defend its sovereignty. We'd like the people of Russia to overcome the oligarchy and the brutal repression of the Putin regime. We'd like the people of China and its beleaguered minorities to ensure greater democracy and liberties. Of course, the progressive forces worldwide will have to unite against all imperialistic aggression and warmongering, resist authoritarian forces in their own context, fight social and economic inequality, fight climate change, and intensify the battle for socialism in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Clifton, for that geopolitical context. We're now moving to Reihana, who is online.
Thank you very much, and warm solidarity greetings from the Partido La Casang Masa, or PLM Philippines, to everyone at the conference, Socialist Alliance, Green Left Weekly, the great panelists, and the organizations that they represent. I want to start off by looking a little bit more at the nexus between climate change and war, or specifically how war contributes to climate change. As we all know, the United States spends more on the military than any other country in the world. And a recent study by universities of Boston and Brown estimate that the US Department of Defense is the world's largest institutional producer of greenhouse gases. And in the US post 9/11 wars, the total US military greenhouse gas emissions from 2001 to 2018 was 1,267 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. And this is supposed to be a conservative estimate because they use Department of Defense data. So, and the study concludes that the US Department of Defense is a major contributor to climate change. Now, I've got some slides with figures, but I won't, I'll put those up at the end. But these slides show, the figures actually show, the graph actually shows how the wars of imperialist aggression, in this case, the US, the correlationship between that and climate change. So you see a huge increase in greenhouse gas emissions during the Reagan years, initiated by the largest peacetime, who initiated the largest peacetime military buildup in US history, a decline in the 1990s during the collapse of the Soviet Union, and another increase from 2001 onwards during the post 9/11 period, starting with Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq 1 and 2. Interestingly, the US airborne operations consume over 70% of total energy and are the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions of the Department of Defense operations. Yes, hello, can you hear me? Hello? Can I get an indication that you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Hello, can you hear me? I think you've muted me. Can you please unmute me? Okay. What's that? Hello, can you hear me? Sunny? Can you hear me?
But I don't think you can hear us.
Hello, can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes, Reihana, we can hear you.
All right, so I'll continue because there was some interruption. I'll just do it on audio.
No,
rather than
Reihana,
video.
hang on. Reihana, hang on. We didn't hear anything. We had a tech failure, so you will have to start from the beginning.
Okay. All right. Let's see if this works. Well, warm solidarity greetings from the Partido Lakas ng Masa, or PLM Philippines, to everyone at the conference. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. I want to start by looking at the nexus between climate change and war, or specifically how war contributes to climate change. As we know, the United States spends more on the military than any other country in the world. And a recent study by the universities of Boston and Brown estimate that the US Department of Defense is the world's largest institutional producer of greenhouse gases in the world. In the US in the post 9/11 wars, the total US military greenhouse gas emissions from 2001 to 2018 was 1,267 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. And this is supposed to be a conservative estimate because it uses Department of Defense data. And the study concludes that the US Department of Defense is a major contributor to climate change. Now, I have some slides, but I won't use those, show those at the moment. I'll keep it for the end. And these graphs show how closely greenhouse gas emissions and US wars of aggression are correlated. And interestingly enough, US airborne operations consume over 70% of total energy in 2014 and were the biggest contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions in the Department of Defense operations. Now, the other speakers have already looked at the US pivot to Asia strategy, which is a military, economic, and political strategy that frames US intervention in the region. But I think it's also useful to have a historical perspective here, and that is colonialism and imperialism are historical phenomenon. They don't just come out of nowhere. They're not instantaneously produced. These are historical phenomenon. And this has very much been the experience of the region, where the struggle for nationhood, the struggle for national sovereignty, the struggle for revolutionary democracy, and the struggle for socialism has also very much been a struggle against imperialism and the imperialist bloc of the global north. The history of China is an example of this. The imperialist wars against liberation struggles in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the bases and military treaties in countries such as the Philippines, and political interventions to set up and prop up dictatorships from Vietnam to the Philippines. And of course, the economic aspects as well, such as the newly industrialized countries' model of development, as in South Korea and beyond. So today there are some similarities, but as speakers have pointed out, but important differences as well, where the central aim of the pivot to Asia strategy and Washington's foreign policy today is curbing the rising economic weight of China and its rapidly increasing influence in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, okay, I've turned my video on. I hope it doesn't interrupt anything. Now, I want to move on to look at a key flashpoint in the possibility of war in the region. and that is the South China Sea and the Spratlys disputes. China claims sovereignty over the South China Sea, and the sea's estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The area is also a major trade route, and there are competing claims of Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. In July 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague issued its ruling on a claim brought against China by the Philippines under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, ruling in favor of the Philippines on almost every count. The Philippines has now renamed the areas that it claims as the West Philippine Sea. PLM then described the ruling as a flawed victory, saying that the Hague victory, at least in the short term, will not unlock the door to peace in the region. Our position is for a two-pronged approach involving both military de-escalation and multilateral agreements. Unfortunately, China has taken to using unilateral moves to secure what it sees as a defensive parameter instead of cooperating with other countries in the region to reach multilateral agreements. We describe this as a bullying tactic driven by an aggressive nationalist stance. China has unilaterally claimed over 90% of the South China Sea with its infamous 9-line map. Basically, this is a refusal to negotiate with other countries in the region, and it has unilaterally established military infrastructure in maritime formations like Scarborough Shoal and Mischief Reef that are in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. In areas where they haven't as yet set up this infrastructure, China is preventing the fisherfolk from provinces such as the Zambales province, which is alongside the South China West Philippine Sea, from fishing. And these fisherfolk are constantly harassed and even shot at by Chinese military vessels. These communities have been fishing in these waters, which are the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, for generations to eke out a livelihood. They fish in unarmed old fishing boats to earn a living and not for some geopolitical interests. The US has leveraged this dispute to its advantage, using this as an opportunity to militarize the region, signing various military agreements, including basing agreements with the claimant countries. The Philippines has signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, with the US, which increases US military access to East Asia, undermining efforts to peacefully acquire territory through negotiations. The Marcos regime, the Marcos Jr. regime, has also increased the number of US basing facilities in the Philippines from 5 to 9. This has been described as a recolonization of the Philippines by the United States. The current government is effectively acting as a proxy for the US. Though the war in Ukraine is a leading geopolitical trouble spot today, the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea are a close second. Taiwan is increasingly becoming a key piece in US militarization plans in the region. Washington's bellicose mood was underlined by the US House former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year, followed by President Biden's explicit commitment to assist Taiwan militarily. While Beijing considers its sovereignty over Taiwan non-negotiable, its strategy has been to promote cross-straits economic integration as the main mechanism that would eventually lead to reunification. Overall, it has been a defensive policy in the region and internationally. But some argue that this has changed to a tactical offensive in the last 2 decades, and that the trigger has been Taiwan. PLM recognizes Taiwan's national sovereignty. At the same time, we oppose US plans to use the unresolved status of Taiwan to pursue war plans against China. While we call on China to stop building military bases in the South China Sea, from bilateral talks on military de-escalation, multilateral talks between ASEAN and China to govern the maritime behavior of all parties with claims, and negotiations on exclusive economic zones, continental shelves, and other sovereignty issues. We focus our campaigns and mobilize and build a mass movement around anti-imperialist demands, such as all imperialist troops out of Asia, all US military bases and facilities across the Asia-Pacific region to be shut down, and the rejection of the US triad, which includes AUKUS, dismantling of all imperialist intelligence infrastructure in the region, such as Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and the Echelon Intelligence Network, and others. The US aggressive regional plan comes amid the grave multiple crises of the international capitalist system, all interrelated and interconnected, which is pushing the US towards a more aggressive path, while the working class masses today continue to suffer from the combined systemic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, the generalized crisis of capital, and the climate emergency. The US war plans will have a disastrous impact on the peoples in the region and a disastrous impact on the climate emergency in the region. And the Philippines is a case in point, a country which has been in a state of climate emergency for decades now. We know that the imperialist bloc of the global north are prepared to fight China to the last Filipino standing and have no concern whatsoever about this or about destroying the ecology in the region. We note that the concept of a just transition is gathering much international momentum, especially amongst development agencies and NGOs, and is at best a perspective of greenwashing capitalism, and is also a cover for the increasing exploitation of natural resources, labor, and especially in the global south. And in the Philippines, we have a classic case of this, which is the phasing out of jeepney vehicles with electric vehicles, which is effectively a phasing in of privatization to benefit big corporations. Global inequities have been increasing between the global south and the north, and they have never been greater since the Industrial Revolution of 1798. Again, I've got a graph and I'll put that up later. And a classic example of this is electrification. And the number of people around the world who are living without electricity has actually increased in 2022 by 20 million. And the increase is mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And in terms of access to technology, the inequality has never been greater as well. So for us, our just transition has to be a transition towards socialism, based on climate justice and reparations paid by the global north for their historic responsibility for the climate emergency, accelerated decarbonization with appropriate technology and appropriate technology transfer uncoupled from market relations and related conditionalities, cancellation of debt, illegitimate debt, incorporating indigenous knowledge, gender justice, wealth redistribution towards public ownership of the means of production, community control over community affairs and state institutions based on people's power. A system that is not based on market relations and capitalist GDP growth models, but one that completely transforms the social relations of capital to those based on socialist principles of solidarity, a solidarity economy and society, what Michael Lebowitz called, Marxist theoretician, recently passed, called a solidarian socialism. In the Philippines, we describe this as a Bayanihan socialism. Bayanihan literally translated means solidarity, and it draws from the egalitarian and communal relations that govern pre-class Philippine society. A society of free and associated producers, as Marx described it, where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Reihana. Not sure if she's going to put the slides up. So we've got a little bit of time left for discussion. I'd like to take 3 speakers, and maybe somebody who's at the front can help out with a roving mic. Each speaker has 3 minutes. Remember that this is still being live streamed. Please come to the front and I'll give you a little tap to wind up if you're coming too close to the 3 minutes. So can I have a show of hands, please, who would like to make a contribution? I'm going to take Bram first because they're sitting at the front. Over there, that's number 2, if you can make your way forward already. And number 3, this is number 1. And number 3 over here. Thank you. Is that on? Should be on.
Hello? Okay. I'm very interested in this conversation, and I think it's just briefly worth mentioning that one of the first demographics left behind during situations of conflict is those living with disability. I mostly mean those at the intersection of poverty and disability. I receive the National Disability Insurance Scheme, so I'm unlikely to suffer until later in the situation when funding gets cut inevitably from the NDIS. But in these discussions, I think it's worth centering that 80% of people with some form of disability don't have access to the funding that I do. They don't have access to much support at all. A pension is not enough to live on when you're relying on expensive medications. And pensions will inevitably not rise as inflation rises during situations of conflict. Inflation is already rising significantly and putting a great deal of pressure on the disability community. And this is just something that I wanted to briefly raise as something to keep in mind during these discussions, particularly when it comes to the intersection of, say, refugees and disability who won't necessarily be able to access any funding from the Australian government. Life gets very expensive very quickly, and disabled lives are often devalued very quickly when we come towards situations of conflict because we aren't effective soldiers. Yeah, that's actually about it for me, so you can probably allocate more time to other people.
Okay. Now, we're not reading about it on the front pages of the papers, but nevertheless, imperialism in the last few months has come up against an epochal challenge on the scale of the First and Second World Wars. And we can see this manifested in the ambition of as many as 20 countries to join the BRICS bloc. And what this means is that there is now a counter-bloc to imperialism that encompasses most of the world's population and that sets out to order the world in ways quite different from what they like in Washington or London. Now, BRICS includes financial institutions that are capable of challenging and providing a better deal than the World Bank. It includes an alternative security system in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And perhaps the most single important development has been the proposal for the setting up of an international reserve currency based on gold, based on rare earths and other strategic materials. And this is intended to replace the dollar in the reserves of countries around the world. Now, already you're seeing a very important process of de-dollarization. Countries unloading dollars from their reserves, looking for other currencies which seem viable to them, looking for yuan from China. Now, the implications of this is that the great advantage that the United States has held through its control over the world financial system, through having the reserve currency in the form of the dollar, is coming to an end. We're going to find the situation in which the United States is no longer able simply to print green bits of paper, but it's able to exchange for the consequences of real labour. And this means that the viability of the US imperialist model is coming to an end. Now, so I'd like to ask the panellists how they regard these developments. What are their implications? What are the implications in countries around the world, and particularly in the global south?
Hi, thank you, and thank you to all the speakers. Fascinating and scary stuff. I guess I just wanted to ask a question for the panellists as well, maybe Jordon, is that what's been China's response to the AUKUS deal? I mean, he said he painted that picture where, you know, they're our biggest trading partners and then all sitting around the table to deal with trade while having nuclear submarines pointed at their heads. What has been China's response? Are they talking about sanctions, or have they responded at all? Or, yeah, that's all for me.
Thank you. We've got one question online, so we're going to hear that question, and then I'm going to give the panelists an opportunity to respond, as we then need to basically go into the workshops. So have to cut discussion short. So go to the questions online, please.
The question was online for Jordon. As a person with a disability, what do the Greens fear Labor's cuts to NDIS will entail? How do the Greens think people with disability can defeat these cuts?
Should I answer that now, or wait for the chair to call on the panel to answer all of the contributions collectively?
I think, Jordon, if you can kick it off, and then we'll go to the other panelists.
Okay. Well, in terms of that specific question, I would say that what we fear as Greens, the cuts will mean for disabled people, is that disabled people currently on the scheme will be kicked off it. Disabled people who currently are accessing supports under the scheme will have those supports cut back, and people that need the scheme in the future will not be able to get the support they need or get on the scheme in the first place. What the government is trying to do at the moment is, I think, manipulate the disability community and gaslight the disability community effectively by saying, no, we're not trying to cut money from the NDIS when cutting money from the NDIS was their single biggest budgetary saving of some $74 billion in the budget. And they're trying to suggest that there will be other services available to disabled people other than the NDIS when those services do not exist, and the federal government doesn't have a disability minister. So there actually isn't an individual whose job it is to coordinate across government to build those non-NDIS based services. What we can do to defeat it, well, as disabled people, we are 20% of the population, some 4.4 million people. We have incredible political power, electoral power, organising capacity. We defeated independent assessments when the Morrison government tried to force that on us. We will defeat these caps, cuts, limitations and changes in exactly the same way, working together collectively at the grassroots level, translating that power into political spaces, and basically ensuring that the NDIS becomes an untouchable third rail, particularly in Australian politics. You cannot make changes to our NDIS without consulting disabled people, because it belongs to disabled people. It is not something which the government gets to cut and change. So we will continue to build the grassroots movement, enabling that to happen, and to organise collectively, to make phone calls, send emails, engage in activist tactics to achieve those goals. I just want to briefly comment on the other two contributions in relation to BRICS and China's reaction. I observe the growth of BRICS with interest. I think that there is value in kind of a series of alliances and structures that challenge that basic American dominance of the financial system. I would caution, though, that we don't want to exchange the chains of one imperial global master for another. The goal should actually be to create a global financial system that serves people on the planet, not the other way around, and not corporate interests. And I don't particularly care if we change US corporate influence and US national influence for the interest of other imperial or dominating nations. So that's my goal. How do we make a better global financial system that actually works for people rather than switching one master for another? In relation to China's reaction, they have been very angry. They've called on Australia to step back from this decision that they see as counterproductive to long-term peace and stability in the region. I'm actually much more interested, though, by the reaction of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Pacific Island nations, who have all expressed serious concerns about AUKUS and the nuclearization of the Asia-Pacific, particularly Pacific Island nations who have been directly impacted by nuclear testing and do not want to see a nuclear arms race in their waters. And just finally, to that point about disabled people being the last one, like the first ones to be left behind in the conflict, that is absolutely right. We saw that during COVID, and I would add as well that minority groups that are already subject to tremendous persecution. So, for instance, let's look at Tibetans and Uyghurs in China. One of the worst things America, Australia, or any other nation could do in terms of solidarity and support for those communities is to escalate military tension with China to the point where there was an open conflict or close to it, because regimes use the cover of military conflict to execute their long-held desires to eliminate problematic minority communities. The Turks did it with the Armenians, the Germans did it with the Jewish populations of Europe, and so on and so on and so on. We have seen again and again nation states and their political leadership utilize conflict, external threat as cover for genocide and the other discriminatory actions against minority communities. So in solidarity with those minority communities, we should be de-escalating these tensions, not increasing them.
Thank you very much, Jordon. I'm now going to get the panelists to respond, Pip, and then Clifton, and then Reihana.
Oh, thanks for the question. Hello? Thank you for the questions. I'm aware that this is just the beginning of the 2 days of lots of discussions. Firstly, on the question from the comrade here on the NDIS, I mean, it's just absolutely staggering. It should shock us to the core that $368+ billion is being spent on nuclear-powered submarines when, you know, the social need here in Australia and the ecological need is so important. And I think that's an important argument to keep raising, that the contrast between what is allocated to weapons of war versus what is allocated to community survival, really. And the Socialist Alliance defends the NDIS because we feel that we have to. It's not the ideal scheme, however, to have this semi-privatised scheme, and I'm happy to talk to you later about We've done an extensive policy on NDIS, and a number of our comrades are very involved in fighting for, you know, a better scheme. But when you hear that, I think we've got a surplus apparently announced just now of $19 billion, first time in how many years from a Labor government, you know, it just makes your blood boil even more. Yeah, so Petrina, you would probably have read that, you know, China's response to AUKUS has been fairly hostile, very hostile, and yeah, they have actually. I mean, particularly under the coalition when it was first announced, you know, they put bans on various imports from Australia. So iron ore, I think, a certain amount of coal, and that's why we diverted to India. Suddenly, India became our great big friend, you know, to get our coal. Wine apparently as well came under big sanctions, and we've just got this foreign minister running around trying to, you know, actually a lot of Australian capitalists were very furious about this, and this is part of the division in the Australian ruling class, which is, you know, China is our biggest export market on so many fronts. Gold apparently is one of the biggest exports too. So, you know, big announcement the other day. Penny Wong said, you know, they've lifted the sanction on wine, or they've lifted this sanction on this. You know. Meanwhile, you know, the whole project continues. I must say, though, looking recently, they've just announced the second tranche of AUKUS. Unhappily for the Labor Party, they announced the first tranche was the AUKUS submarine deal, which got everyone's attention, particularly the sums involved, but the nuclear element and the unresolved waste element and everything else. But the second tranche is more about cyber security and quantum weapons and physics that I don't understand, but this is, you know, this is just building the defence industries and all the rest of it, which if they'd announced that first, everybody would be, yeah, yada, 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 what's it really going to do? We're just becoming a bit more sophisticated. But no, they had to announce the submarine deal first, and of course that was a fiasco as well, because we had a previous submarine deal going with the French. Anyway, so this is, yeah, I mean, China's clearly opposed to it all because they can see quite frankly, you know, what is going on here. So, you know, I mean, I think one thing that I didn't emphasise enough probably, or didn't emphasise at all, which is, you know, the racial element that is going to build up. I mean, we already saw during COVID that international students and students of Asian descent in particular were getting hammered from the Chinese virus because they somehow or other were responsible, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine what was going to happen when, which actually is not going to work necessarily for Labor or any government. It's not going to work their way either. How many, you know, there are people in this room that would know better than me how many international students are in Sydney and Melbourne at least, and they've got a lot of friends and they've got a lot of networks, and they're going to see straight away, if they don't already. They do already. So the anti-racist element of this anti-war campaign has to be front and centre as well. Now, Senator Jordon Steele has answered another question about NDIS, was directed to him, so I'll leave that there. Thanks, Renfrey, for your comments and for asking us for our comments, but I'd like to direct everybody to go to Sam's workshop. It's coming on next, where a lot of this will be discussed in a lot more detail. The breakup, you know, the challenge to imperialists, who are the challenges, what we can do to assist in our own small way but important way, and join the discussion there. Finally, I'd like to say that in all of this discussion, I think it is important to keep in mind the class character of this new challenge to us. I sort of like the way Senator Jordon described, you know, it in a more personal way, the domestic need for a change for this new AUKUS deal. But you know, people may not have long memories, but I think it is our responsibility to actually show the continuum between what major parties, the major capitalist parties in Australia have done. They have worked lockstep on drives to war, and we've seen it more recently. And I think it's important to say that while we definitely are applauding the fact that there's a section of the Labor Party called Labor Against War that we welcome into the broader anti-war movement, they're going to find some internal contradictions there, because there's a section of that movement which is, as Peter Garrett puts it, we want to upgrade our defence capacity because why? Because we need to. Because why? Because we have to. But meanwhile, those resources go away from exactly the resources that we need to be spending here and now. So I think it's important to take a slightly longer view, because Labor has been a party of war. It hasn't been a party of peace, whereas the Greens stand proudly as being a party for peace, and we need everybody to work together. Finally, I want to say that I think it's an important time too to paint an alternative vision of how the world could be. It's pretty doomsday, frankly, for an upcoming generation that's inheriting the struggles or involved in the struggles, and you've got to be able to, without being glib, you've got to be able to say how things could work if the sane people were in charge, which is, what we're aspiring to do here. And I like Reihana's comment about our just transition is actually a transition to socialism. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for the questions. I really have just 2 points to make. One is what Comrade raised about the intersectionality of poverty and disability. I think that's an absolutely crucial and extremely crucial that we think about it. I would say that really the question is just not about militarization in that sense. It's also about the kind of priorities that the governments have today. So the kind of budgetary allocations, say even for education, for public health, for public transport. I was staying in Comrade Jacob's house, and I see that there's a campaign going around for democratization even of the tram system over here. So I think this entire budgetary allocations is something that escapes a kind of a very, very vigilant kind of an eye. And I would say that that's something that generally across the board, across countries, this is something that really is of great consequence and relevance. The second thing about BRICS, like I said, I mean, without a doubt, a multipolar kind of a global order is definitely way better than this kind of an imperialistic kind of bloc that operates today. But having said that, there are extremely important questions of democracy, of liberties, of freedoms in each of these nations. I think those battles are as important as it is, when we talk about it in a global sense. Thanks.
Reihana? Oh, Reihana's gone. Well, Reihana's gone. Apologies. Well, I think we can thank our 4 very inspirational speakers setting the context for this conference, but also the opportunities for moving forward. We are running a little bit late, so I would like to ask you to go straight to the workshops, and I'll just point out where they are. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, one of them had to be cancelled, and that's the West Papua workshop. The Freedom versus Fortresses workshop with Bruce is being held in this hall, so you can stay here, and that one will be streamed as well. The Unions and Community Change workshop is happening downstairs next to near the Rego. And Imperialism in the 21st Century is on this floor just out to the right. Thanks, everybody.
that was the one I'd actually decided. Thank you.